The Center for World Catholicism is founded in order to make connections between the Catholic Church in the global south and the Church in the global north. And in some ways we're inspired by the reality that the center of gravity of the Church has moved south. You may have heard the statistic that at the beginning of the 20th century, 30% of the Catholics in the world lived in the global south, and by the end of the century, 70% of the global Catholics did. But in some ways, that statistic is misleading because it tends to reify these two spaces, south and north, as if they were two completely separate spaces, and there's a fixed population in each. But what we're going to be talking about over the next few days is the reality that the south is in the north and the north is in the south, and Catholics are very much on the move in ways that aren't completely unprecedented in history, but the scale on which people are on the move is, I think, in some ways unprecedented in history. And so it really calls for theological, sociological, philosophical, anthropological reflection on what this means, what it means for the Church. There are different kinds of Catholicisms that are created when people are in diaspora and displaced in some place that they haven't been before, and interesting sort of mixtures of different kinds of Catholicisms that are happening. And we also want to reflect on what it is that the Church can lend to understandings of these different kinds of contexts and lend to the practices of peace and justice in these new kinds of contexts as well. And there are very few people in the world that are better qualified to reflect on, I think no one better qualified to reflect on these realities than Professor Lamin Sanneh, who's with us tonight from Yale Divinity School. Professor Sanneh was born in Senegal in West Africa and is the author of many books and hundreds of articles on religion, history, and the interaction between the two. Abolitionists Abroad, American Blacks and the Making of Modern West Africa, Christianity and Islam in Secular Britain, Faith and Power, Christianity and Islam in Secular Britain, Whose Religion is Christianity? The Gospel Beyond the West, and the book that first introduced me in graduate school to Professor Sanneh's work, Translating the Message, which I'm happy to see has been brought out in a second edition. It was a work that had a great impact on many of us at doing PhD work at Duke back in the 1990s. I could go on and list Professor Sanneh's many accomplishments. Let me just list a few. He's honorary research professor in the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. He's the recipient of an honorary doctorate from the University of Edinburgh. He's a life member of Clare Hall, Cambridge University. So he's had many honors within the academy. He's had honors within the Church as well. He's been appointed by John Paul II to the Pontifical Committee for Historical Sciences, and he was appointed twice by Pope Benedict XVI to the Pontifical Commission for Religious Relations with Muslims. We're very, very happy to have Professor Sanneh with us, and very honored to have Professor Sanneh with us tonight. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you very much for words of welcome. I'm honored to be invited to this meeting, this conference, and it really doesn't take much to persuade me to come to a conference on world Catholicism, since so much of my own work has been in the worldwide dimensions of the Christian faith, of the Christian Church. I'm delighted to share these ideas with you, and I really do mean share, and to reflect with you together on the implications of a faith, of a religion that since the middle of the 20th century has really exploded, much to the consternation of historians and other observers who long predicted in the 1960s that the decline of Christianity was set and that the end of colonial rule also meant the end of the missionary era in Christianity. And there was confident prediction that we would be arriving in a new age of secular neutrality concerning religion. And lo and behold, we're in the middle of one of the most remarkable stories of expansion of Christianity in the history of the religion. My theme tonight is Sovereign God and Sovereign Nations, Truth and Difference. But I want to say right up front that one of the things I'm looking forward to is having a conversation with you in the audience. So I shall tailor my remarks to a very, I hope, general outline of the issues, and then we can have conversation. And if there are students in the audience, they're particularly encouraged to engage in this conversation. I really enjoy having interaction with students, the leaders of tomorrow. Whether we are gathered or scattered, communities of faith beyond the West today confront challenges and opportunities that are particular to the post-Western phase of the worldwide Christian movement. Just as new nations were coming into existence with faltering steps, we now see new communities of faith were also emerging with contrasting energy and momentum, creating the double challenge of membership in the religious community and membership in the national community. The duties of religion intersect with the demands of nationality, making obedience to God an obligation simultaneous with loyalty to the nation. While Catholic social teaching addresses this dual obligation from the point of view of normative values, both in the church and in society, it has not done so to the same extent from the point of view of emerging post-Western societies, where fragile political institutions and resurgent communities of faith have converged and indeed often collided, with people of faith bearing personal responsibility for this dual heritage. The lecture, this talk, will use the framework of this dual citizenship and dual loyalty to try and analyze, examine some of the great challenges we face as a result of Christian expansion today. One of the most remarkable developments in the history of Christianity, as I said at the beginning, has been the unexpected, surprising, unprecedented expansion of the religion from the middle of the 20th century. Let me tell you a story, an anecdote that illustrates this problem. When I finished my undergraduate studies, I went to the Middle East, where I was a student at the American University of Beirut, AUB, and the Near School of Theology. And after that, I was studying Islam and Arabic, because I saw myself at a very young age destined for work in interfaith, interreligious relations. I went to Nigeria after Lebanon. And in Nigeria, my official position was tutor in Islamic studies for the diploma course at the University of Ibadan. I was also aware of a history seminar that was led by two of Nigeria's leading historian scholars, Jacob Ajayi and Emmanuel Ayandele. You should understand that at the time in Africa, African history, particularly African Islamic history, was really making great strides. New manuscripts were being discovered, archival sources were coming to light, graduate students were flourishing. And the theme of the seminar was the end of Christianity in Africa. And there were dissertations being written on the subject, books being published. And I remember once trying to get to the seminar from where I lived in Ibadan, in North Ibadan, and finding my way to the university blocked by throngs of people who had spent the previous night in prayer and meditation and hymn singing and so forth and so on. This was the beginning of the great charismatic movement in Africa, but particularly in Nigeria. And I would be rather irritated by these throngs of people blocking the way, the roads, so slowing down traffic and inevitably making us late to arrive for the seminar. And when I arrived at the seminar, we resumed the conversation, the discussion. Academics are pretty grim and determined people. We will resume the conversation about the end of Christianity in Africa, the end of the missionary era, the end of colonial rule. Christianity was finished. Now, today I smile at this, but at the time, we did not see the evidence of the growth and exponential expansion of Christianity. We did not see the evidence. You may say, well, but the evidence was there. It impeded your progress to the seminar. Yeah, but I didn't see it. I didn't see it. And the reason for that is because we did not have a category, a rubric, that would allow the evidence to come into our consciousness. The rubric, the framework we had for studying Christianity and understanding Christianity was that Christianity was Western imperialism as a framework. And therefore, the end of colonial rule must logically, rationally, mean the end of Christianity. And so the evidence I encountered on the roads just didn't matter. We didn't have eyes to see. It's rather embarrassing when you think about it, because academics think they are smart. And also that they are open-minded, a virtue. It turns out that our own categories actually imprison us, hold us in. Now, it took me maybe nearly 2 decades to appreciate the significance of what I saw in Nigeria. It took me 2 decades. Now, I may be slow. I'm not, traditionally known to be very slow on the uptake. But I don't think I was alone. I think there were many, many, many scholars who really did not see any future for Christianity, let alone in Africa. A colonized society, shaking free of colonial rule, and why would it embrace Christianity? I had another hat, which was as a student of Islam, and there was tremendous confidence among scholars that Islam would rise and overtake Christianity in Africa. So let me just give you a couple of statistics. In 1900, there were 8.7 million Christians in all of Africa, compared to 35 million Muslims. Muslims outnumbered Christians by a ratio of 4 to 1. In 1960, when Nigeria gained independence, the ratio was nearly the same, about 60 million Christians in Africa, 148, 150 million Muslims in Africa. But by the end of the 1980s, by 1990, the ratio of Muslims and Christians in Africa was reversed. Although scholars continue, even, believe me, even today, there are scholars writing saying that Islam is destined to outgrow Christianity in Africa, the rest of the world. And statistically, that is not the case. If you look at the facts on the ground, quite different. Now, given this unprecedented growth of Christianity in Africa, many of us among the folks who are really looking at religion as historical phenomenon feel that it is time to ask the question, what are the implications of this for society in Africa? This is a very big question, and in many ways, America is not a good place to try to raise this question and wrestle with it, because Americans have sort of dealt with this question with the Federalist Papers found in documents of this nation, and you settle the question. And so when I looked at the bishop's statement on faithful citizenship, it's quite clear that the framework of this document is American citizenship and participation in the political process. Now, much of this language is really irrelevant, completely unrelated to the realities that people face in most of the third world. And I'll be speaking a little bit about that, I hope. The fact of the surge of Christianity has confronted believers, Catholic, Protestant, and Pentecostal, with a pressing question. And that question is, ultimately, where does our identity and where does our loyalty lie? And if I may take Africa as an example, the question of identity and loyalty for most Africans is not a question of citizenship. It is not a question of what passport people carry. The first question we in America ask people from abroad when they come here is, what country are you from? What's your nationality? What passport do you carry? Well, in most of Africa, the idea of citizenship remains very abstract and very tenuous. And it's very difficult to mobilize the national community on the basis of citizenship. Ethnicity, kinship, and above all, religion. These things matter more than issues of political citizenship. On the ride to the city of Dakar from the airport, I shared a taxi with the son of one of the leading Muslim Brotherhood orders in Senegal, the Tijaniya. The man is actually an international banker based in the Middle East, I think in the Gulf states. But he was visiting Senegal, Dakar, and because he comes from a prominent religious family, he was on his way to meeting the president of Senegal. I was on my way to the market to buy roasted peanuts. On the way to the city, he pointed out to me that it was a secular holiday, right, a national holiday by the state, and that the streets were empty and it was very, very thin crowds. And he said to me, if this was a religious holiday, the streets would be filled with crowds, and we, meaning the leaders of the brotherhoods, Muslim brotherhoods, could actually fill the stadiums at a moment's notice. It shows you, he said to me, and I never forgot this, it shows you that religion is able to galvanize Africans in a way that politics is not. And I started to think rapidly, if nationalism is correct in its assessment of colonialism as Western imperialism, surely Africans should be delighted that the colonial era has ended and the National Independence Day celebrations will be crowded with people grateful for having overthrown the yoke of foreign control and domination. And yet, in very, very few places in Africa, do you have any enthusiasm expressed to celebrate national independence days? Think about it. That was the first time I started to think quickly about what it is that defines our identity as Africans. And that religion is at the very core of what we understand personhood to be. So it confronts us then with these very sharp questions. Where ultimately does our identity lie? Nationalism and citizenship have international backing. You have the United Nations, you have the International Court of Justice, you have all these international organs. And many of these countries in Africa use that international backing to basically misrule their people. They're not able to deliver economically, they're not able to, they can flout the rules of justice, the rule of law, because the international system requires these states to exist for the international order to be meaningful. And by the way, I fully subscribe to the Catholic bishop's point that the nation state is for the common good. And I'm not, there's no way you can get around that, it seems to me. But there is a question to be asked about the moral and the ethical nature of citizenship and the idea of the sovereign nation state. So for these new Christians in Africa, the idea of political sovereignty is counterbalanced by the idea of divine sovereignty. And political sovereignty, as I say, has international backing and even a kind of diplomatic cachet. But divine sovereignty has very little international recognition. And this is the kind of imbalance, asymmetry between being fully human, conscious of who we are as children of God, on the one hand, and on the other, as subjects of a nation state whose sovereignty is actually more oppressive than liberating. You see what is going on here? All of these ideas I gleaned from the ground in Africa. And I lived in Nigeria when the Civil War started, and I went back as the Civil War was ending. And religious leaders, mostly from the South, were wrestling with the question about reconstructing a new nation after the trauma of the Civil War. The role of religion in that was discussed somewhat, but was dropped. And so it left believers with a very unsatisfactory situation. Their hearts and minds were gripped by religious fervor, while national leaders were claiming total control over the citizens and over national resources. And it made for government for the good of the people extremely difficult to pull off. And so corruption, the rule of law, injustice, even the arbitrary arrest and execution of political dissidents, all these things have gone on to the bewilderment of local populations. And that is why, because Christianity has become so dominant in the lives of so many Africans. Catholicism in 1960, 23 million Catholics in all of Africa. Today, 2014, 200 million. In 1900, 8.7% of the population of the whole of continent of Africa was Christian. Today, it's over half, 50%. So given the surge and the prominence of Christianity in Africa, I am persuaded that we have to confront the question of these two sovereignties. Divine sovereignty, the sovereignty of God, and political sovereignty, the sovereignty of the nation state. For many, many ordinary people in Africa, women and children included, the nation state is a disaster. It's a disaster. When I've spoken like this, many of my Catholic friends have said, oh, you are trying to bring in a theocracy, you're trying to bring in a kind of rule by the church. And my answer to that is the idea that we would tempt theocracy to come into play in Africa is so remote as to be absurd. And it certainly is not a question that keeps me awake at night. But the real challenge, however, is to retrieve the wisdom and the ethical teachings that were there in the old Africa and reclaim them for the lives of people now very much governed by their allegiance to God and to the church. There are remarkable stories, I'm sure many of you know, of the response of Africans in the face of disaster, and the fact that in these communities, what keeps people going is the hope that they have in the God they believe in. A few months ago, I was in Zimbabwe, and driving from Harare to Mutare, near Mozambique, across the border there, quite a long trip. And I said to my driver, who are all these people filling the streets and the fields? It was rather getting to about 2, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And he said, oh, these people, it's like Nigeria, have been praying all night. And then he added, he said, you know, the reason why Zimbabwe has not erupted into bloodshed and violence is because people like these have been praying. And the driver himself never went to school. You know, he's a driver for the university. His wife works in the university, I think, in the kitchen. His daughter works in the office. So he's very grateful to have a job within the family. But you cannot really misunderstand his feeling that the state, the government, has betrayed the people. You can't really misunderstand that. And it seems to me this is the tension. And Christianity, the gospel, offers us hope. But more than that, I would say, gives us a space in which we can develop creative ideas about how to balance the obligations of obedience to God and loyalty to the nation. The church is not subversive of the ends of good government. And the dignity of human beings that is at the heart of Catholic moral and ethical teaching is absolutely critical for political sanity and for social responsibility. It is the case, in fact, in many of these countries that the churches are the only viable social institutions left. There are many wonderful stories of how these churches are poor. I went to Mass in one Catholic church in the village, and I was so impressed by the liturgy, the vernacular liturgy. I asked for a tape from the Catholic sister, and she laughed at me. She said, well, you can see the church, we don't even have a ceiling. We can't afford a ceiling here. And talk about machines to record anything. We don't have that kind of money. It was a remarkable experience for me. I had jet lag in the morning, so I couldn't sleep, so I took early taxi, went to the church, and I was there in plenty of time before the Mass. And the more popular time for Mass is 10 o'clock in the morning, and I was there at 7:30. But when I got there, the church is long, so maybe it can take 200 people. When I got there, there were about 150 people there already at 7:30 in the morning. And 15 minutes later, the church was absolutely full to capacity, 200 people. And by the time the Mass really got going, the crowds had overspilled. People were sitting in the windows, and there were vehicles, taxis, and people sat on top of the taxis so they could hear the Mass. There is no public address system. So the church was encircled, and this was only 8 o'clock, not the most popular time. So at the end, I think there were probably over 400 people there. But the impact of Christianity on the lives of ordinary people, you really have to see this to believe it. I mean, merely my telling you will not, I don't think, give you the real flavor of what is going on. There's something that's really gripped people's imagination. And I think this presses on us the obligation to produce, if you like, a charter of citizenship and religious freedom in Africa, especially vis-a-vis Islam. I don't want to say too much about Islam. You can bring it up in your question time. But when the churches in many parts of Africa are challenged by Muslims to produce a document, something, to address the question of faith, religion in the public order, Christians have said, including Archbishop Desmond Tutu and others, Christians are not interested in a state that concerns itself with religion. And Tutu said expressly that Christians want a secular state that is neutral towards all religions. And Muslims respond to Christians by saying, we came to you because we thought you were a religious people and you would give us religious reasons why you want to participate in public life and in political life. And Muslims offer Sharia, whether it's civil law or penal law, offer Sharia as a blueprint for society and for the state. And Christians have said, we don't want Sharia, we want a secular state. So the argument has been rather one-sided in a sense. Muslims have been making all the religions running, and Christians have sort of embraced secularism as a fallback. And so the Muslim argument has been, well, you Christians, you're really secularists. You just want a secular state. And that leaves the religious ground to be occupied by Muslim arguments. Now, if you see that religion has such a powerful effect on the lives of people in Africa, you will see that vacating the religious ground is actually surrendering a very critical initiative. I was actually going to bring you the South African Constitution, which I looked at when it was being framed. It is very disappointing. If you get a chance, you can bring it up online and read it yourself, and you will see how ad hoc it is. It's sort of grabbing pieces here and there and sticking them together, saying, well, now everyone's interest is represented. There is no overarching vision about the nature of the human being. In this bishop's document, they make the point that we are not only political beings, human beings, we are also social beings. Well, actually, I want to go before that. I want to argue that, first and foremost, we are moral beings before we are political beings. We are moral in the sense that we are invested with the capacity to distinguish between right and wrong. If we can't distinguish between right and wrong, not that we are always moral ourselves, but if we can't make the distinction, then our freedom is impaired, necessarily and profoundly. By the way, I'm drawing this from one of Madison's published statements, James Madison. He makes the point that the freedom that is at the basis of a democratic society, the consent of the citizen, is actually derived from the conscience of the believer. You and I worship God and are called to love God and our neighbor, not because we are compelled or coerced or intimidated, but because we're free. My worship of God is nullified, is voided, if it's compelled and coerced and forced. And Madison argues that it is the same source, from the same source, that we get the idea of the freedom of the citizen, of the consent of the citizen. And Madison was convinced that Christianity is divine in that sense. That is to say, it is based on a divine freedom and divine justice. That moral idea is at the very heart of the project we are interested in introducing and initiating and guiding in Africa. You really don't have to convince Africans about this whatsoever. The fundamental idea of the human being is that we are given to one another. And Africans would say it is not for nothing that God has given us to each other and to one another. Right? It is not accidental. It is not fortuitous. There is a very, very important reason for that. And from this idea of being given to one another, the idea of society develops. And the obligations we owe one another, Africans experience in the home from their siblings, and how you relate to your siblings, giving and taking, learning the language, correcting and being corrected, somebody holding your hand, you holding somebody else's hand. And from this, the bishops actually put this in the same language. From this develops a very strong sense of community and society. And in that sense, the state is derivative of the values that form us and give us our dignity as human beings, rather than the state being prescriptive of our humanity. And that is the consequence of having to accept the moral roots of human personhood. Now, I think that this project of accepting this dual heritage and dual responsibility, obedience to God and loyalty to the nation, requires very critical and very intense reflection so that we don't give up one for the other. It's very easy in the United States for politics to co-opt religion. And usually politicians are very good and very quick at commodifying religion. Alexis de Tocqueville, in his famous Democracy in America, said that government, by habit, prefers what is useful to what is moral. And if you give it a chance, if you give government a chance, it will require the moral to be useful. It will convert moral teaching into political expedience. And that's very dangerous for even the idea of freedom itself, because one of the reasons why it is important to make this distinction between faith and politics is that politics needs to be constrained. You need to constrain it, because power, by its own nature, is very voracious. Power wants to consume. And when the Americans decided to create the republic that we know today, the United States, they had many models of statehood available to them. The classical, the Hobbesian, they had ideas from the French Revolution, Rousseau and Voltaire. They had, all kinds of the monarchy from the British, aristocracy, the rule by the aristocracy. They rejected all these models and instead opted for a model of government in which freedom of religion, not freedom from religion, but freedom of religion became pivotal for the enterprise that they set themselves to construct in America. Jefferson, in a letter, I think published in April 1803, said that he reflected on the Enlightenment heritage and tried to bring the American experience to bear on the Enlightenment heritage. And he saw that the philosophers were wonderful in terms of their achieving or obtaining what Jefferson calls tranquility of mind. But, Jefferson added, they really did not have any ideas to offer us about how to create a moral community of mutual support and mutual interdependence. I'll give you the accurate citation in the question time if you like. But here Jefferson shows that the American experiment was unprecedented because it took elements of the Pilgrims in the New England and elsewhere, elements of their vision into account. And in doing that, the American experiment was unprecedented. It tried to create something new. And at the heart of it is religion, in the sense that by allowing the sovereignty of God to be the guiding principle of America, we have an assurance, according to Jefferson and Madison, of curing the problem of tyrannical despotic rule. Because despotic rule is an infringement on the right of God. Government can see it all, can do it all, can be it all. And this sort of secular theocracy, Americans were afraid of, as much as they were afraid of religious theocracy. But a right understanding of religion helped them to overcome the dangers of secular theocracy, as we saw in the French Revolution. And think about this for a minute. The French Revolution gave Europe Napoleon. And the American Revolution gave the New World Washington. Washington was voted life president. He declined. He declined. And that, believe me, saved the American Revolution. Because that was, he could have accepted life presidency. Everyone was, ganging for him to do that. But this idea, therefore, of the modest nature of political power, if political power is going to be productive, derived from this sense, the divine sovereignty cannot be impugned or contravened without political cost. And now, you may say, what does this have to do with Africa, where I began? When I arrived in Nigeria, fresh from college, I had in my sack a copy of the Federalist Papers, actually James Madison. And I was reading Madison in Nigeria as the Civil War was getting going. And I thought, Madison's reflections on the nature of political power really were relevant to the discussions taking place in Nigeria. And when Nigeria came to frame its national constitution, they chose the American model. I didn't know they would do that, but you can see what is going on. And I have no doubt that similar discussions, conversations are going on in many, many other parts of the world, including from limited correspondence with Chinese scholars in China itself, which I discovered at a conference of scholars at Shanghai. Anyway, I want to stop here because I want to engage in conversation. The paper that I've written for this conference will be available in text, but I'm not going to presume to read a lecture to you because I want to have a conversation at this point. Thank you.
Should we hand the microphone around?
No, they can sit. Because we have to catch.
Thank you for your comments. What is responsible for the great growth versus just regular growth in Africa Christianity?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, but let me, it's an exciting question, so let me expand it. The beginning of the growth of Christianity, as I said, was really in the late 50s and the early 60s, just as Africa was slipping away from colonial rule. So, one point of transition there is to suggest that colonialism was an impediment for Christianity. And as soon colonial control was being loosened and slackened, Christianity started to take off. And the colonial inhibition had got out of the way. Second reason, I think, is that the development of Christianity engaged the older religious dispensation of Africa in a way that it did not under Westernization. The areas of the greatest impact of Christianity are in the rural areas, and in areas, therefore, before and behind Western schools, and the whole Enlightenment infrastructure of roads and clinics and electricity and silent plumbing and all of that. It's a very interesting overlap. Another interesting insight is that everywhere that Christianity has expanded in Africa, it has also revived and retrieved the memory of the name of God. Let me put this the other way. Everywhere that people have not been able to remember the name for God before Christianity, they've remained resistant to Christianity. It's a very interesting theological problem if you think about it. I give you some examples. Senegal, among the Wolof of Senegal, where the Catholic Church is welcome. I'll tell you a little story about that in a minute, in a way that surprises many American Catholics. The Wolof, if you ask the Wolof, what name did you call God before Islam? They don't really know, they don't remember. People don't know, they don't remember. Christian conversion among the Wolof is to the same extent inhibited and suppressed. Now, as I said, Senegal is very open to Christianity. It's 95% Muslim, but it's one of the only Muslim country that has as a national holiday the feast of the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin. It's a national holiday in a Muslim country. All the embassies closed down in August for the feast of the Blessed Virgin. Senegal also observes Pentecost, the birthday of the church, as a national holiday. So you see what I mean? The country, society is not hostile to Christianity, but it is not receptive to it. It is not receptive. It's a very interesting problem. I stumbled on this and I said, wow, what's going on here? Another reason for the expansion of Christianity, I don't know how many of you speak Wolof, but I have attended the Wolof liturgy in Dakar as well as in Banjul. And the Wolof in the liturgy, in the Catholic liturgy, is wonderful Wolof. It's very simple, very direct, unadorned, artless, and it really is moving for that reason. Anyway, I've become very interested in language and vernacular use in Christianity, including in the West itself. The English language itself was impacted by Christian translation. And the language of Alfred of England is very different from the language of Elizabeth, for example. And I think the Wolof has really been, if you like, elevated and given a kind of nobility of spirit within the liturgy itself. I wish I had a PhD student to do a PhD on the vernacular liturgy in the Catholic Church. It would really reveal extraordinary areas of understanding. 2 words in Wolof, for example, from the liturgy to thanksgiving. Eucharist itself is thanksgiving, right? Ngirim. Ngirim. Yalla Ngirim. We thank God. The word for compassion in Wolof is Yirim. Now you see how close those two are in sound? Phonetically, Ngirim and Yirim. Using this in the language in Wolof immediately made people so sensitive to the role of Mary as the mother of Jesus, right? Childbirth, kind of divine compassion, Yirim. And this becomes tied in with the idea of thanksgiving, giving thanks to God. So, the way we use language in the West is quite different. For us in America, Jesus and God are swear words. But if you are working within the vernacular, there's a different kind of momentum is built The whole worldview of the African is religious. On the flight here from Hartford, I was listening to popular music from Mali and Senegal in the vernacular. And even when they're doing secular songs, it's infused with religious sentiment. And one line in it says, for example, only truth is worthy of itself. Wow, I thought, how full of theological meaning. Only truth is worthy of itself. Only truth is worthy of itself. Wow. This is a secular song. So it seems to me that vernacular exerted a tremendous pressure, sort of, for a population that was finished with colonial rule and looking for its roots and looking for directions. Christianity offered something new. As I put it to my students, Christianity makes you an offer on terms that are too good to refuse. It's like saying in the vernacular, I'm a religious person. It's the same as saying I'm a human being. But how can you say I'm not religious when that would mean I'm not human? It doesn't make sense. This is why Pope Francis, erupting into the public consciousness the way he has really done something really remarkable. Because what he has done is basically to say to people that faith is something that the church does not do to you. Faith is something you have in you. Kindness, compassion, humility, perseverance, hope. And people say, what? Even young people in this country are moved by that. And it gives a different twist, a different understanding to the meaning of faith. So those are some of the reasons. And it's against tremendous odds that people are embracing Christianity, including death. Their lives are at risk. Churches are burned down. People are killed at mass. And yet there is joy. You know, they're not gloomy or despondent. There is joy. It's a big question, yeah.
Should I come up? So I'm not exactly clear on how people still practicing African traditional religions are assimilated into Christianity, but theologically speaking, how do those people who are being assimilated negotiate the morality that's presented to them in Christian doctrine?
So the question is how, you mean converts coming into Christianity, how to negotiate issues of morality? Well, you have to start with the idea that these traditional societies are very conscious, aware of doing right by their kin group. After all, one of the, you may say, problems of traditional society is that they are overburdened with a sense of cross-cutting obligations. And I think if we do not overthrow that structure of a sense of obligation, if we don't overthrow it, but rather capture it, take it in, and build on it within the church, it's a very powerful ingredient for creating community, a sense of belonging. And this is why I say, you know, coming to a conference like this, World Catholicism, it's not like carrying coals to Newcastle, you know, doing something that's an oxymoron or superfluous. But I'll give you one story. Father Richard Farmer, who was educated at Harvard, became a leader of the charismatic movement within the Catholic Church in Latin America and also in Africa. Published a story by a Nigerian convert to Catholicism and charismatic Christianity. And this convert said that one of the things that he realized was that he had to do right by other people. He felt the obligation to go and meet people from whom he was separated, to make peace and reconciliation with them. And he wrote this up in his story. So the point is that, you know, these structures are in place, the ethical and moral structures are there. And the church has ready-made material that it can actually use to build a sense of community. And that community transcends tribe and ethnicity. But transcends does not mean ignore or overlook or slight. I think what Christianity does is to take those gifts that are there, the natural gifts, and to reveal their greater potential. My own life, my own experience, if I may be personal for a minute, when I became a Christian from a Muslim background, there was nothing I wanted to do more than to be baptized in the church. But the next step I took was to go back to the Muslim community, to my father, to my brothers, my sisters, and to say to them that I actually feel that I love them more than I ever knew and ever could. And that this love was not abstract, it was not just tentative or provisional. It was love with no strings attached. And I never really felt that before. It's always tactical, you know, you sort of manipulate people to get what you want. But it seems to me that Christian morality sheds a different light on the issue. And just 2 days ago, I was in touch with my brother, and we were trying to set up something for the family. And he said, yeah, we'll do this part of the compound for my son, we'll do this part for the house, etc. I said, what about the women? Now, he was receptive to that because I am close to them, you know, I haven't sort of burned my bridges with them. So that ideas of equality of women, when they hear it from me, they are not antagonized by that. He said, yeah, I will tell my wife and we'll do something there. So there you go. So it seems to me, you know, when I taught at the University of Ghana, Pat Ryan from Fordham University, Jesuit, was my colleague. And he started a little Bible study group at the Atomic Research Center where we had our flat. And maybe 5 people got together Saturday evening. And this was in the 70s. Today, they built a cathedral. Yeah. In a matter of a few decades, they built St. Patrick's Cathedral in Quebec. So this movement of Christianity is happening in our own lifetime. And because we are so close to it, the proximity does not allow us to gauge the significance of what is happening. But I think it's quite remarkable.
Thank you, Dr. Sanneh, for initiating this conversation. You mentioned the charismatic expression a couple times, and so I think I have a two-part question. One is, to what extent, when you were sharing that story, to what extent does charismatic Christianity sort of capture the Nigerian imagination as opposed to Western imperial forms of Christianity? And then the second part is, to what extent does charismatic Christianity have to be factored in whenever we consider the global South and Christianity coming from Latin America, Asia, and Africa?
Can you, the one question is about charismatic Christianity.
Just in contrast to Western imperial Christianity.
Yeah, okay.
And then the other question is, to what extent, when we're considering Christianity coming from the global South, do we need to consider the impact of charismatic expressions from the global South?
From the global South
Right.
to the on the North.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, well, the Ugandan Christians, toward the end of colonial rule, were really puzzled by the attitude of Britain to Christianity on this score. They said, well, in England, Christianity is integrated into national life, so that the Queen takes an active role in the church. So why do you object, they're asking the English, why do you object to our chiefs playing a role in the church? You know? And then Ghana said, well, you accuse us of being syncretists, but why is it that the local bishop will go to the commissioning of a ship and they would break a bottle of champagne and he would say prayers? Isn't that a form of syncretism? And when we do the same here, we pour libations and ask for prayers before public events, you accuse us of syncretism. Now, these are very refined arguments. What charismatic Christianity did was to break through that sound barrier and to confront societies and individuals with the claims of the gospel. It is not difficult to read the scripture, to hear the scripture in a traditional society. It really is not difficult. For us in the United States, children of the Enlightenment, even if we are lost children of the Enlightenment, we need checkpoints. We need filters in order to make religion safe to believe. Whereas in Africa, people are not afraid of religion. And the reason is they know tremendous damage that politicians have done to their societies. I think that's really one of the reasons. The impact of the global South and the global North, in many ways, I think we see in Pope Francis an example of that. We look at history chronologically, and so we look at the New World from the point of view of Columbus' journey to the New World, and we see the impact of Europe on the societies of the New World. What we don't realize is that there is a reverse flow, that the consequence of Columbus coming to the New World is that New World ideas and values are going to get back to Europe. And so you get Las Casas, for example, saying to Europe, you cannot carry on trade as if it's morally neutral. And the treatment, you cannot come into proximity with indigenous populations, with native populations, purely from the point of view of profit and exploitation. Right? Now, Europe had not really prepared itself for that, right? But that's one of the consequences of Columbus coming to the New World. And Alonso de Sandoval, another Jesuit, declared already in 1610 that freedom was the very heart of what it means to be human. And therefore, slavery was a violation of the most basic teaching of the gospel. The Curia, the papal Curia, in 1686, published an encyclical condemning the slave trade. Most Catholics don't know this. Most Catholic think that the Catholic Church started to take action against the slave trade only with Francis Lieberman in the 19th century. But this started already in the 17th century. And it was only 2 years later, 1688, that 3 pastors from Pennsylvania published a letter in which they attacked slavery in America. But the Curia had already come out with a statement condemning the slave trade. So these experiences, and then the propaganda fide, which was the engine for Catholic missions abroad, was created as a direct response to appeals from Africa, from the Soil Kingdom, from Congo. We began already in the 16th century to say to Rome, please free yourself from the domination of these Portuguese. The Portuguese traders, the Africans said in their petition, are a disgrace to Catholic faith. And that energized the Curia to create propaganda fide in 1620. Became the most significant machinery for the direction of Catholic missions abroad. So these consequences we're still having to work out, but it seems to me that religion, Christianity offers a chance for a two-way flow of information. Franciscan missions in Mongolia in the 14th century introduced art forms from Mongolia that contributed to Florentine art and Renaissance art in the 15th and 16th century, right? So many ways in which the church became itself a powerhouse for the confluence of cultures. World Catholicism, that was in the DNA of the church right from the beginning. And the politics may be different then than they are today, but the same pressure, the same impetus, the same ferment was going on. And it really is remarkable. On the Protestant side, same thing. But the impact of the global south on the global north has been a long growing impact. And today we see examples of that, aside with Pope Francis coming from Argentina. But one of the things I should say is about the Catholic Church, one of the amazing things about the Catholic Church, that we talk about reform from the top down. But Pope Francis shows you that he is expressing ideas and values and styles in a way that acknowledges where the church is already. Right? He's not saying, well, I'm here, you are there, come and follow me. You are there, I'll be with you. And that is, for me, one of the most extraordinary things about the church, which belies the stereotype of the Catholic Church as a top-down, hierarchical, bureaucratic church. I think it's the other way around. My own mentor, Richard Gray, in his history of the papacy in Africa for 400 years, has documented this historically. That the church is really better seen as from the bottom up rather than the top down.
Hello. I actually have a comment and a question about the colonialism. I had a question too that didn't they realize? I mean, that the English and the Portuguese, they were all Catholics, or they were all Christians.
Yeah.
So I don't know why they would have suppressed that. I wasn't sure how you were defining colonialism. I wanted to bring that up as well. But just to let you know that Catholics were persecuted in England. I didn't know if you wanted to comment on that forever. And the Anglican Church isn't really, it's more like a, from what I understand, because I was born there, my mother's English, it's more like a state-run thing. And you have to remember who started it. It was Henry VIII. So that's their religion. So I don't know if you can quite take that seriously, but I wanted to throw that in there. I realized the Spanish, the Dutch, the Portuguese were all down in France, down in Africa as well. So there's a lot of mixes of religions in each one of those countries, and wherever else was down in Africa.
Yeah, you should, you said the English or the British were Christian, and why did they hide that or suppress that. Well, actually, I have argued in some of my writings that colonial rule posed one of the most serious obstacles to the expansion of Christianity abroad. It was government policy in Nigeria, for example, to use public funds to establish schools for Muslims from which Christians were excluded. And this was the policy in North Nigeria. In a college, you can look it up, called Barewa College. It's a very famous college, a kind of English public school style of schooling. And one of the British were convinced that they wanted to create a Muslim political elite in these schools. They also wrote about Christianity being an impediment to colonial rule because Christianity gave Africans the idea that they are the equals of Europeans. And this was unacceptable. And the native tribunals, which were administrative organizations in colonial Africa, made sure that Christians did not serve in the native tribunals. It's a very complex story. But why is that? Well, I think we have in this an example of the cultural captivity of the gospel. Now, in Senegal, under the Third Republic of France, which was very anti-clerical, when the French arrived in Senegal, they wanted to suppress Catholic schools. Muslim leaders led a delegation to the colonial authorities to protest, to oppose the closing of Catholic schools. These are Muslim leaders. Why? Because they said if the French closed Catholic schools, they would also close Muslim schools. And you see the reasoning here is, how can we trust you when you are anti-religious when it comes to Catholicism, and it would next be our turn at some point down the line, so we and the Catholics will form a solidarity group against the imperial masters. It's a fascinating story. It's not the way it's usually told in history books. But colonialism was very ambivalent about Christianity, very, very ambivalent. Lord Lugard, the architect of Britain's tropical empire in Africa, himself the son of a missionary to India, was actually adamant that there shall be no mission schools in North Nigeria, except in the Middle Belt. But even the Middle Belt of Nigeria, Kaduna down south to Bida, the confluence of the Niger and the Benue, that's kind of middle belt that Islam was not able to penetrate effectively. But under British rule, the middle belt was opened up to Islamic influence. And so colonialism, some Muslim scholars have even said this, colonialism became an engine for a kind of Islamic jihad. Nima Levision, who was the Dean of the Arts and Sciences of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and the specialist, recognized authority on Islam in Africa, has argued, he died recently, but he argued that colonialism was more effective for the modernization and the consolidation of Islam in Africa than any jihad movement. It's a very interesting argument, historical argument. So it's a complex thing. But I do think what is happening now is that the cultural captivity of the gospel is being challenged from the bottom up. And I haven't read Tony Blair's political memoir to see what he makes of religion as a Catholic convert. But I think there is a line in the memoir where he recognizes the limits of politics over against religion. And it's a very important distinction to make. In the 19th century, there was a joke. A lord of the House of Lords was asked what his religion was, being Anglican. And he said, well, he hadn't thought about it recently, but he could answer that question when he saw the next bill of Parliament. Because the Anglican Book of Common Prayer is an act of Parliament, right? And the Archbishop of Canterbury, when he's installed, has to make a pledge to the Queen, in this case, but to the monarch. So they still have to sort out. And the tension, a lot of ferment in global Anglicanism is really about whether the establishment and the cultural centers of privilege and power are adequate for explaining Anglicanism. If you're an Anglican in China, let us say, or in India, the British establishment is not your rationale for being an Anglican. So you have to find another reason. And I think this is part of the tension, growing tension.
I'm aware that we're close to the end of our time. We might have time for one short question, or else we can let Professor Sanneh have some rest and dinner. Is there anyone who want to make a... Okay,
Somebody's itching to ask a question.
Yeah, okay.
What's interesting to me, Professor, is these things are happening in our American government right now. The government is taking over religion and everything else. It's left and right. And all these churches, what's happening in different colleges, and here it's in Africa, and now we're seeing it here. Religious freedom is being challenged on every end. The media is there, Hollywood, everybody is just attacking Christianity.
Yeah, I mean, I think one must never underestimate the influence of the church. In England, when the Home Secretary in the government of John Major, the Conservative government, introduced a law about police powers in Britain. One of the clauses of the bill was to give the police the right to compel priests to divulge information given to them in confessions. And I got a clipping of it from the Times. It was reported on in the New York Times as well as in various journals, magazines in the United States. And often people want to say, well, the church is just being too concerned with itself. I don't think there is any issue more critical to the issue of political liberty or freedom than the liberty of the church to nurture and nourish the roots of the heritage. Though, and this is the point I want to make, the church is never too reluctant to share the fruits and the consequences of Christian teaching and Christian devotion and consecrated service. If you think of what Catholic schools have produced and the way they have added to the common good, the same thing is true in the Muslim world, by the way. The same thing is true in Africa. Remember the controversy about the mosque at Ground Zero, Imam Faisal Rauf. His wife, Daisy Khan, was actually educated in Catholic schools in Pakistan. That's why she got the name Daisy. And the same thing is true in the Middle East, in Turkey. You can never underestimate that. So this is one of the reasons I say that we as Christians must make a very important distinction between the idea of a Christian society being very different from the idea of a Christian state. Very, very different things. A Christian society, Christians may be a minority, but their ideas of compassion, of justice, of the dignity of the person, of ministering to the excluded, of humane treatment of people, of the rule of law, the prison system, the incarceration rate, hunger, malnutrition. These ideas are not minority ideas. They are not minority ideas. These ideas are fundamental to any society that is worth living in, whether you're a Christian or not. And so this is why the campaign in Africa that I'm involved in is to draw our attention to the importance of contributing to the notions of a Christian society separate from the idea of a religious state. We don't want a religious state. Tocqueville's observation is acute. Government prefers the useful to the moral. If you give it a chance, it will convert the moral into the useful, so that religion becomes a commodity. And you and I know, you see, we in America are very tempted to politicize everything, but you and I know that politics is a game. Now, as citizens, we better know the rules of the game and how to play the game very well. Oh yeah, very hard-nosed. But religion is not a game. Religion is not a game. And that distinction is crucial for the credibility of politics to be effective in governance, as well as for the credibility of religion. And religion cannot surrender the teachings of the church to political convenience or pragmatic considerations or calculated manipulation of people. And so that distinction of the Christianization of society and the Christianization of the state are really two different processes. And I think, if I may be frank for a minute here, I think it's misguided for Catholics to think that we can form an effective alliance with the religious right in this country. Because there I see real dangers of the politicization of religion, of reducing religion to purely a game that we play. Well, thank you very much for your
Thank you, Professor Sanneh, for getting us started on this conference about Catholics in diaspora. The conference goes on the next couple of days. We've got a tremendous lineup of speakers. So please join us, and please join me one more time in thanking Professor Sanneh.